Hello and welcome. I'm Ashwin Ahmed and I'm in conversation with Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee. A seasoned diplomat, Ashok Mukherjee has defended India's interests all over the world. Sir, but I want to come to you now with your experience in Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union. You obviously have many interesting eyewitness accounts to tell. Let me start with Yugoslavia first. You were there at the beginning of what I may call the uprising, when national sentiments of all the countries were taking place. What were the eyewitness accounts you saw, and could you share them with us?
Well, when I reached Yugoslavia, it was my first assignment, and Tito had died, the former president of Yugoslavia. And following the death of Tito, there was obviously an interest in what would happen to that country after the departure of a strong ruler. What happened on the ground at that time was very interesting in the sense of how it in a sense foretold what would happen to the country. On the ground, soon after the death of Tito, the barriers between the 6 republics of Yugoslavia started coming up, first in the economic sense. So while we were living there, we stopped, for example, in Belgrade, getting goods which were produced in Slovenia or goods in Croatia. People in Slovenia would not get goods from Macedonia or from Serbia. Now, these are all independent countries today, but in 1980-81, when I was there, they were all part of Yugoslavia. The main reason for this kind of protectionism or barriers that came up lay in the constitution of Yugoslavia. And that's something that we saw in our day-to-day lives, that each republic had the right to actually not only protect what it saw as its own interests, but also in the constitution it had the right to secede from the state.
So this is the international context. But what did you see as everyday life in Yugoslavia? Were our Indians living there in any way impacted? And if so, what measures did the mission have to take?
The first impact was on the shortages that started. And I remember all of us had to queue up till 1 at night to get 1 liter of cooking oil, for example.
Really?
Yeah, this was in 1981. There was a shortage of essential commodities like sugar, like wheat, like oil, cooking oil, and these were the first items of day-to-day life that got impacted. Later, that snowballed into bigger issues like supplies of goods, cars, and manufactured products, which also then impacted on the local population. And we, in a sense, could not purchase in Serbia something that was made in Slovenia. That kind of thing was unexpected when you lived in a country which was till then one country.
So can I ask you now, was there violence?
The violence that actually started in 1981 and thereafter in a province of Serbia called Kosovo. And most people in 1981 had not looked at Kosovo. But part of our job as political reporting for our mission was to follow events in Kosovo. And in following and tracking these events and talking to people who lived in Kosovo, certain things became clear to us in 1981, which became clear to the rest of the world 15 years later. Things like identity, language, history. These issues played a big role in creating the volatility which the rest of the world in the 1990s, especially 1998, came to associate it with Kosovo, when NATO bombed Yugoslavia for 78 days to get so-called independence for Kosovo.
Sir, now I want to take you to the issue of the former Soviet Union, where you played a direct part in opening 3 missions, if I'm not wrong: Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Right. Now, sir, again I'll ask you, what was everyday life like there? Of course, we know there was mass rationing, there was apparently chaos on the streets as the Soviet Union ended its days.
You know, I think in the case of the Soviet Union, most of the people were not prepared for the breakup of the Soviet Union except the three Baltic states. The three Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia had for a long time been agitating for different status within the Soviet Union, and they had been supported by a very active diaspora, which kept alive the fact that before the Bolshevik Revolution, these three countries were actually independent countries. But the rest of the 12 republics of the Soviet Union were not preparing for independence and a separate existence. So when it happened in 1991 December, it came as a trauma for the population all across these 12 republics. We were living in Central Asia, and our area were the five stans, the five independent states today of Central Asia. And in none of these five states had there been any mass movement or any intellectual discussion on a possible independence from Soviet or Bolshevik rule. So intellectually, therefore, there was no elite available to guide a newly independent country when it emerged on the world stage. So that was a very...
Sir, I want to come to the personal part of it. Obviously, it was a time of unrest. So, coming to yourself, and did you feel unsafe while going out? Were there any anecdotes particularly that you remember?
Yeah, I think the one thing that happened, which I remember even till today, is that because of the uncertainty which lay behind the growing violence and instability that enveloped the southern part of Central Asia, the first symptoms were when the police, who were actually supposed to guard the embassy, themselves started erecting steel barriers around their booths and barricading their windows, and we felt that if these were the people who were supposed to protect us, they were more busy protecting themselves. And then we understood that actually a lot of the movement and the sentiment that came up from under the ground was directed against the symbols of the power of the Bolshevik state, which in a sense in Central Asia and in most of the other republics seamlessly transformed from being symbols of Bolshevik power to symbols of the new state. Change did not happen, new people did not come. The same people seamlessly transformed themselves from Soviet to post-Soviet.
Some ambassadors have said in a time of great crisis, often there's a fear of personal safety, number two, managing staff, and of course managing the Indian community at that time. So how did you deal with these challenges? What were the challenges that were put forward to you?
Well, the first challenge was protecting the mission and the staff of the mission. And we were conscious that as this area was becoming independent in neighboring Afghanistan, the Mujahideen had overrun Kabul, and we played a role in the evacuation of our mission from Kabul. So we were conscious, very conscious of what could happen if the kind of instability that enveloped Afghanistan would envelope Uzbekistan or the other republics of Central Asia. The only republic which actually confronted this kind of volatility was Tajikistan, which slid into civil war. And the Indian community at that time in Tajikistan was mainly of students, and they were the ones who had to be evacuated. Most of them were students from Jammu and Kashmir. So we, sitting and responsible for our relations with Tajikistan, had to work with the friendship societies of India in Tajikistan to get them to help us rather than the state, because the state apparatus was non-functional and it was caught up in a civil war. And it is to the credit of ordinary Tajiks that they went out of their way first to make sure that the Indians who were living and studying there were protected, were safe, and then eventually that all of them could travel from Tajikistan up to Tashkent and then be evacuated by air to India. So that was one part. But we had 3,000 workers in Uzbekistan when the Soviet Union broke up. And this was the first time that private sector Indian companies had entered the Soviet market, and they were in construction. So there was Larsen and Toubro and there were Tata projects. They were constructing luxury hotels. And each project, there were 3 projects, one in Tashkent, one in Bukhara, one in Samarkand. Each one of them had 1,000 workers who had come from India. So how to look after the welfare of these workers, how to make sure that they would get their food, their pay, and that they would not be sucked into the violence that was already raging below these cities was a prime concern for us.
Ambassador, you had to function in a crisis time where communications are not what they are now. You had to deal with Delhi, you had to deal with frightened students, you obviously had to deal with parents with must have been flooding the mission with queries. Now what I want to ask you is, what was your average day like? I mean, how did you function in that sense? Did you actually have to go physically to meet the students? And in an area of civil war, was your life personally in danger? Did you have to travel with guards? How was your average day like during this time?
I think in Tajikistan, I went to probably 3 times to Tajikistan because the way to travel there was by air. So we flew from Tashkent to Dushanbe. But as the civil war overtook the country, then all these forms of communication themselves came to an end. And because we were able to evacuate our students in the early stages of the civil war, there was no need for us to then go and look after our consular issues in Tajikistan. Uzbekistan was very different because Uzbekistan was already by then under a very strong autocratic control. So that control ensured that whatever violent sentiment was there on the ground was kept bottled. And the main area where this sentiment was bubbling under the ground was in the Fargana Valley. The Fargana Valley is a distance from Tashkent, so it didn't affect us in our day-to-day life. But because we had to travel from Tashkent to Bukhara and Samarkand for the Indian labor that was there, we had to travel by road to Samarkand or by air to Bukhara. These were on the surface calm, and they were under strict control of the regime. So in terms of their security, they were safe. But in terms of their subsistence and their earning capacity, they were left to the mercy of they were just not the responsibility of the state at all. So we had to find ways in which the workers could actually subsist and work and earn and perform the job they had come to do. And there came out the kind of sentiment that we saw in Bukhara, for example, when the local authorities said, we have no foreign exchange. All the foreign exchange of the Soviet Union was kept in Moscow. So when independence took place, these countries had no foreign exchange. So they, even if they wanted, they could not pay for these projects. So the suggestion given locally was that if your workers can help us to sell the cotton, because we produce raw cotton, and Uzbek cotton is of world quality, then we would be able to use cotton as a barter to generate foreign exchange in the world markets and pay the workers and pay for the projects. Now, I still remember the 1,000 workers of Larsen and Toubro all volunteered to go out and do cotton harvesting. Right. And that came as, that was the first time that the local population actually saw that the sentiment that links our two regions, which we have seen so many films about, but that was actually a very real sentiment, because nothing compelled those workers to volunteer to go out and harvest cotton.
I will ask you the same question as I did regarding Yugoslavia. Did you see mass-scale rationing? Did you see, we saw very dramatic times during the Soviet Union where people were declaring their anger against Gorbachev and the fact that they could not buy bread, etc. So A, was that the rationing part was there? And number 2, was there violence again on the streets or the threat of it? And if so, how was law and order maintained?
Well, the second question is easier to answer because, as I said, apart from Tajikistan, in Central Asia, violence was controlled by the very, what we would call autocratic leaders who asserted their authority, and because there had been no opposition or alternatives to them, whatever they said was carried out by the existing. So they were able to control the law and order situation. But on the shortages, what struck people who lived through that period in Central Asia was the fact that in most of the 5 republics of Central Asia, there were no manufactured products. All manufacturing was done in the non-Asian republics of the Soviet Union. So we didn't have day-to-day products like bread or processed bread or butter or sugar.
How did you manage this?
So these were managed, then what actually we confronted was the fact that in its own history, this region had been the host to a lot of people traveling up and down and carrying goods from point to point, what we could call the Silk Road. So I think it's that Silk Road syndrome, if I may call it that, which came to the assistance of people like us, because somebody came with a box of New Zealand butter, I remember, one day, and said that I've got New Zealand butter, but now I need to buy tea. So he wanted to buy tea from India. So
these were just locals, sir.
These were locals, and everything happened in a barter system.
Right.
So butter was exchanged for tea, or raw cotton was exchanged for goods, clothes, for example, and that's how that system began. Today, when you see these countries, you can see how much progress they have made. I mean, today...
So, sir, you had a regulated system where someone would come maybe every day or once a week and barter? Is that?
You had to go to the local bazaars, and this is something that probably, this was a feature of Central Asia,
right,
that most of their day-to-day activities, economic activities of even food, clothing, anything of that kind would take place in the bazaars. So in Tashkent, we were fortunate that our embassy was located next to the biggest bazaar called Alaiski, and that was full of products. But in winter, you stared the reality in the face, because in winter there was nothing except radishes that were being sold. So it depended therefore on seasonal ebb and flow until they got their act together. And today, of course, these countries are so different. But at that time, they didn't have these basic infrastructure. You asked about communication. I still remember that the only way to communicate with Central Asia was through post. And if any letters came to Tashkent by post, then all those letters which were addressed in English used to be given to the Indian embassy every morning, and the local authority expected the Indian embassy to translate the English into Russian for them to deliver the post. So apart from our other functions, we were also functioning as an outpost of the local postal system. And this was before email was used, so the post was important. Communications were by air because the distances are very large. I mean, Central Asia, as by itself, is larger than India, so it's a very large area. But population is very sparse, so travel was by air. And what happened was, the day independence was declared, each of the 5 republics kept the planes that were on the tarmac on the airports of their capital cities, and those became the nucleus of their own airlines. So Uzbek Air actually was all the aircraft belonging to Aeroflot, which were parked in Tashkent, and next morning they all became Uzbek Air. And the first thing they did was try and use this asset, because there are a large number of aircraft. Tashkent was the 4th largest city of the Soviet Union, so they used this aircraft and they tried to get into international air traffic. And the first and most paying, profitable route that they opened was the route between Delhi, Tashkent and London, and they could see the demand for passengers on this route.
Ambassador, what were your instructions during this time from Delhi? Because obviously events were unfolding at such a rapid pace. From 91 we had the Soviet Union, and by 92 we had the republics. So what were the instructions from Delhi, and what was Indian diplomacy there for you?
Well, the first instruction was to establish direct contact with the leaders of the new governments that took power. So, Mr. Dixit was Foreign Secretary at that time, and he called me to Delhi and he gave me these instructions as the Charge d'Affaires, because he said that from March 1992 I would be designated as the Charge d'Affaires, and we had still to open the embassies in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So, he said try and get all the 5 leaders of the newly independent Central Asian states to India, and we would use these visits to sign the first agreements which would regulate our state-to-state relationship. For India, this was actually a very new experience, because in 1947, when we became independent, we inherited the state-to-state relationships with other countries. We didn't have to, with each country, negotiate a political and an economic document, foundation document. But with these 5 Central Asian states, we had to negotiate both the documents. The political document was easier because they understood what it was. But for them, all of them had been brought up in a Soviet command economy, for them to enter into economic foundation agreements with the market economy, which India had become in 1992 with our reforms, this for them was a very big learning experience. And they probably, it took a long time to adjust to this new reality.
How easy or difficult was it to get physically in contact with these leaders? Can you share some experiences?
It was for Indian diplomats, it was easier because we were the only foreign presence when independence took place. The other foreigners in Central Asia at that time, and they were all located in Tashkent because the Soviet regime did not allow foreign representations in any of the other Central Asian republics. So the only colleagues I had were the Libyan, the Cuban, the Mongolian, and the Afghan. So, so there were 5 of us, and when they became independent, Turkey was the first big medium power that came in with Turgut Özal, who was a fantastic visionary statesman, and he brought with him the business culture of Turkey. And till today, you can see that the small and medium enterprises of this region actually owe a lot to the initial impulse given by Turgut Özal and Turkey. The United States came in March 1992 after they closed a lot of the embassies in Africa. So they came in a campaign in which they opened all the embassies in March. The problem for China was that China had not negotiated its boundary settlement with the Soviet Union. And among the parts of the former Soviet Union with which China had boundary disputes were Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. So the Chinese came by 1991, but they didn't have the kind of access that people like us had. So for us to access the new leaders whom we knew when they were the Soviet leaders was easy, and we got all of them to come to India within a few months. So it was...
I'm going to ask you to shed a little bit of your diplomatic garb and be an eyewitness here. What was it like entering a room of the dictators themselves? Was it a certain amount of grandeur must have been there? What was the experience like?
You know, I still remember the first time we had to invite the president of Turkmenistan, a very enigmatic person called Sapar Murad Niyazov, who passed away a decade later. But he kept us waiting for 4 hours, and we didn't know whether he would meet us or not meet us. But his foreign minister, right, who had been a former Soviet diplomat, called Boris Sheikh Mohamedov. So he told me that, look, we'll wait and he'll meet us, but I don't know when he's going to come. So it was quite clear, even at that time, that the kind of structures of governance and of life in each of these republics were actually going to be very, very unique to them. Turkmenistan is much more tribal than, for example, Uzbekistan, which is much more cosmopolitan, or Kazakhstan, which on the surface is much more cosmopolitan. But I think one thing that we are seeing today is the re-emergence of the old tribal identities and ways of behavior. So this is an area where a lot of countries who are now partners of this region need to invest a little bit of their time and energy, because what are those tribal identities and how have they mutated into the 21st century is something that will determine the way the diplomacy with this region goes. And it's not going to be driven so much by the traditional paradigms of terrorism and radicalism and so on, as much as their identity as tribes.
Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing your memories with us. Thank you.
Thank you.